The Azure Dreams Resort was a tropical paradise, renowned for its serene beaches, luxurious villas, and impeccable service. Its secluded location, tucked away on a private island in the Maldives, made it the perfect destination for those seeking both relaxation and privacy. It was here that Victoria Anderson, a bright-eyed 18-year-old from Tennessee, was supposed to be experiencing the honeymoon of a lifetime. But what was meant to be a blissful escape quickly turned into a nightmare. Victoria had met James Crawford, the 70-year-old hotel magnate, a year earlier at a charity event in New York City. Crawford, an imposing figure in the hospitality industry, was known for his vast fortune, his charm, and his obsession with young women. Victoria had no idea at the time what she was getting into. She was just a young woman, struggling with family issues and the weight of a mother's cancer diagnosis, when Crawford offered her an escape in the form of wealth, fame, and promises of a better life. Their whirlwind romance had been fast and intense, moving quickly from casual meetings to a lavish engagement. Despite the significant age difference, Victoria found herself drawn into the magnetic aura of Crawford, who lavished her with attention, gifts, and promises of a brighter future. She didn't see the red flags at first: Crawford's controlling nature, his possessiveness, or the subtle manipulation that slowly chipped away at her independence. By the time their extravagant wedding took place, it was clear that Victoria was no longer the carefree young woman she had once been. But even on her honeymoon, something felt wrong. Victoria's nerves had been on edge ever since they arrived at the Azure Dreams Resort. The stunning beauty of the place seemed to mock the unease building inside her. As the days passed, the isolation she felt from her friends and family back home in Tennessee began to weigh on her. Crawford had insisted on handling all the arrangements, leaving Victoria little room to breathe. She was, after all, his new wife, his possession in many ways, and he wasn't about to let her stray too far. It was on the night of July 15, 2022, that Victoria's life would take a chilling turn. She had been in their private villa, a stunning ocean-facing suite complete with floor-to-ceiling windows and a plunge pool that overlooked the sparkling sea. Yet, despite the luxury surrounding her, she felt trapped. The walls of the villa seemed to close in on her, the quiet hum of the ocean outside unable to calm the storm brewing within her. She had tried to call her sister, Sophie, back home in Tennessee, but Crawford had taken control of her phone, monitoring her every move. Victoria's distress had been mounting for days, and that night she decided to take matters into her own hands. After much hesitation, she borrowed a phone from Amara Rashid, a waitress who worked at the resort. Amara was one of the few staff members who wasn't intimidated by Crawford, and Victoria trusted her enough to ask for help.
Amara had handed her the phone discreetly, and Victoria made a brief, cryptic call to Sophie, her twin sister, who had always been her rock. Sophie had sensed something was wrong even before Victoria's call. It was brief, almost rushed, but it was enough. Victoria had spoken in hushed tones, urging Sophie to be careful, to look into something that didn't seem right. She mentioned Crawford, though she didn't go into detail. The last words she spoke were chilling. "I think he's hiding something. I'm scared, Sophie." Then the line went dead. The call ended abruptly, and Amara, who had witnessed the exchange, was left with a feeling of dread. Victoria had not returned the phone, and by the time Amara checked the villa later that evening, there was no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. At first, James Crawford did not seem overly concerned. He had gone about his evening as if nothing was amiss, dining alone in the villa's private dining room, and only after 36 hours did he finally report his wife's disappearance to the authorities. The delay in reporting was odd, but Crawford had his reasons he would not immediately share with the police. In fact, Crawford did not even notify the local authorities directly. Instead, he first made a series of phone calls to his legal team, ensuring that all bases were covered. He knew that his influence in the region, coupled with his financial power, would give him the leverage to handle any situation. Even the fact that Victoria had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, with no trace of where she had gone, did not seem to faze him. The Maldives, with its idyllic beauty, had become the backdrop for a dark and troubling mystery. The resort's management, eager to avoid bad publicity, did not initially cooperate with the investigation. The staff was told to stay silent, and Crawford's legal team scrambled to control the narrative. But one person was not easily intimidated: Detective Jessica Blackwood. Blackwood had been assigned to the case when it was finally reported to the local authorities. She was a seasoned investigator, known for her tenacity and sharp instincts. As she began to piece together the events of that fateful night, she quickly realized that something about Crawford's story didn't add up. Crawford had claimed that Victoria had gone for a walk alone, that she had slipped away without warning, but there were inconsistencies in his account that suggested otherwise. In the villa, Blackwood found blood traces, signs of a violent struggle, and a broken phone, none of which aligned with Crawford's explanation of the events. The scene suggested that Victoria had fought back before disappearing. The fact that Crawford had delayed reporting her missing raised suspicions, and Blackwood couldn't shake the feeling that she was dealing with something far more sinister than a simple disappearance. But the mystery of what had happened to Victoria Anderson was only beginning to unravel. As Detective Blackwood dug deeper into Crawford's past, she began to uncover a chilling pattern, a pattern of exploitation, manipulation, and dark secrets stretching far beyond the luxury of Azure Dreams Resort. Detective Jessica Blackwood had a knack for finding connections that others overlooked. As she reviewed the evidence at the Azure Dreams Resort, she couldn't ignore the mounting suspicion that James Crawford's involvement in Victoria Anderson's disappearance was not a matter of coincidence. The scene in the villa had given her too many unanswered questions. Victoria's blood, traces of a violent struggle, and a broken phone were clear indications that something had gone terribly wrong. The villa itself was pristine, as one would expect from a luxury resort catering to high-profile guests. Yet, beneath its polished exterior, there were unsettling signs of a violent altercation. Blood stains smeared the walls near the sliding door, and a small, delicate necklace, one that Victoria had been wearing in the wedding photos, was found shattered on the floor. These items spoke volumes to Blackwood, revealing that whatever had happened to Victoria, it was no accident. She had fought back, and there had been no sign of voluntary departure. The broken phone, too, was an anomaly. It didn't fit the narrative that Crawford had painted. He had claimed that Victoria simply walked out of the villa, but the shattered device, which had been in her hands only hours before, told a different story. If Victoria had left on her own, why had she not taken the phone with her? Why had it been broken in such a specific manner? As Blackwood continued to process the scene, she noticed something even more chilling: Victoria's personal diary, carelessly tossed under the bed, partially hidden behind the furniture. It was a small leather-bound book, the pages filled with Victoria's handwriting, which seemed to grow more frantic and worried as the months passed. The last entry was particularly striking, written just days before her disappearance. It read, "James has become possessive, controlling. He's hiding things I'm not supposed to know. I found something, something that connects him to the disappearances. "I don't know how to get away. I'm scared." It was clear from the entry that Victoria had begun to suspect something darker about her new husband. She had uncovered something that could expose him for who he truly was. But what had she found? And had that discovery sealed her fate? Blackwood's hunch about James Crawford deepened as she examined the broader context of his life. The investigation quickly revealed a disturbing pattern. Crawford's name had been associated with several other disappearances of young women, dating back nearly a decade. The cases had been quietly swept under the rug, as wealthy and influential men often found a way to avoid justice. Jennifer Hayes, Maria Santos, and Ashley Porter. These were the names of just a few of the women who had vanished under strange circumstances, their disappearances marked by similar patterns. All were young, vulnerable, and had ties to Crawford's hotels or properties. The cases had been closed with minimal investigation, often dismissed as simple disappearances or accidents. But now, in the light of Victoria's case, it became clear that these women were more than just victims of coincidence. Crawford's dark history was beginning to emerge, and Detective Blackwood was determined to dig deeper. A more thorough examination of the financial records associated with Crawford's empire revealed disturbing evidence: offshore accounts, bribes paid to local officials, and connections to private islands where wealthy men, including Crawford, held secretive retreats. What stood out the most, however, were the surveillance systems. Crawford had extensive monitoring operations across his private properties, many of which were isolated and inaccessible to outsiders. These systems, coupled with his vast resources, allowed him to control not only the women he targeted but also the narrative surrounding his crimes. It wasn't long before Blackwood stumbled upon another shocking discovery: an encrypted file buried deep within the resort's computer systems. It contained footage from the security cameras on the night of Victoria's disappearance. The footage showed her entering a private area of the resort, where she was approached by someone who appeared to be Crawford. They spoke briefly before Crawford led her into a more secluded section of the villa complex. The cameras had been deliberately disabled in this area, making it impossible to trace what happened next. But that brief moment on tape confirmed Blackwood's suspicions: Victoria hadn't just walked away. She had been led somewhere, and it wasn't voluntary. As the investigation deepened, so did the portrait of James Crawford as a predator. Crawford's charming persona had made him a revered figure in the hospitality industry, but behind his wealth and influence lay a darker truth. Over the years, he had cultivated a network of employees and associates who turned a blind eye to his actions, or were paid to do so. Women who worked at his resorts were often pressured into silence, and those who tried to speak out were swiftly dismissed or intimidated. Crawford's money and power allowed him to keep his operations running smoothly, ensuring that his predatory behavior remained hidden from public view. His pattern was clear: he preyed on vulnerable young women, those from broken homes, struggling families, or financial difficulties. Victoria had fit this mold perfectly. She had been lured in by his promises of a better life, with gifts, paid tuition, and medical treatment for her mother. It wasn't long before Crawford had her under his control, isolating her from her family and friends, limiting her access to the outside world. But Victoria, unlike his previous victims, had begun to fight back. She had uncovered something about Crawford, something so damning that she had planned to expose him. Her diary was the first clue that Blackwood had found, and it gave the detective a sense of urgency. But there were still too many unanswered questions. What had Victoria discovered? How had Crawford silenced her before she could act on her findings? The investigation into Crawford's past and the mysterious circumstances surrounding Victoria's disappearance brought little comfort to Sophie Anderson, Victoria's twin sister. Sophie had been the first to hear her sister's cryptic phone call, and since that moment, she had been consumed by the need to find out what happened. She had never trusted Crawford, and now, her worst fears were being confirmed. Victoria was not just missing, she had become another victim of Crawford's twisted game. Sophie's search for answers led her to the resort, where she teamed up with Detective Blackwood. Together, they began to uncover more about Crawford's operation, his network of connections, and his many victims. It was clear that Crawford had been carefully covering his tracks for years. But Sophie was relentless. Every step she took brought her closer to the truth. She knew that finding her sister, dead or alive, would be the hardest thing she would ever have to do. But the fight for justice had only just begun. As Detective Jessica Blackwood and Sophie Anderson dug deeper into James Crawford's operations, the full extent of his predatory history began to surface, linking the powerful hotel magnate to a chilling network of abuse, exploitation, and silenced victims. Crawford's empire, built on luxury resorts and private islands, was not just about wealth and power. It was a carefully constructed facade, a way for him to control and manipulate vulnerable young women. Crawford's strategy was disturbingly simple. He preyed on women who were struggling, often from broken homes or financially desperate situations, like Victoria. He used his vast wealth and influence to isolate them, cutting off their connections with family and friends. For many of his victims, he had been their savior, paying for medical bills, tuition, and even offering them a taste of the high life. In return, they were expected to submit to his desires, his demands, and ultimately, his control. Sophie, though devastated by her sister's disappearance, was determined to expose Crawford for what he truly was. She spent countless hours poring over the evidence Blackwood had gathered, financial records, security footage, and emails between Crawford and various high-ranking officials. The more she learned, the more she realized how deeply entangled Crawford was in a web of corruption and manipulation that stretched far beyond the resort where Victoria had disappeared. It became clear that Crawford was not just a businessman, he was a predator, and his wealth was built on the suffering of countless women. What troubled Sophie most was the fact that Crawford had been operating with impunity for so many years, protected by his vast resources and the network of officials he had bribed or influenced. In her darkest moments, Sophie wondered how many other women were out there, victims of the same twisted pattern. But she didn't have the luxury of time. Victoria was still missing, and every lead pointed to the possibility that she might have become just another casualty in Crawford's ruthless game. While Sophie and Blackwood focused on tracing Crawford's financial dealings and uncovering his corrupt ties, the breakthrough came unexpectedly, through the testimony of former employees of the Azure Dreams Resort. One by one, staff members who had worked under Crawford began to come forward, willing to speak out about what they had witnessed during their time at the resort. Among them was Mia Hargrove, a former front desk clerk who had worked at the resort for 2 years before she quit, unnerved by what she had seen behind closed doors. Mia had always suspected something was off about the way certain women were treated at the resort, but it wasn't until she overheard a conversation between Crawford and one of his associates that she realized the full extent of the operation. "They're just property," she heard Crawford say, his voice cold and calculated. "As long as they stay quiet, they're worth more to me alive than dead." Mia had been too frightened to speak out before. But after hearing about Victoria's disappearance, Mia decided it was time to tell the truth. Her testimony was invaluable. It confirmed that Crawford had not only been exploiting young women for years, but he had been using his resorts as fronts for trafficking, blackmail, and even murder. Mia's account was corroborated by several other former employees, each of whom described a system where young women were systematically manipulated, isolated, and coerced into staying silent. They spoke of women who were terrified to leave, who had nowhere to go, and who were constantly monitored by surveillance systems Crawford had set up throughout the resort and his other properties. It wasn't just about power, it was about control. Crawford had created an environment where the victims couldn't escape, and the staff who might have helped were too afraid of losing their jobs or facing retribution. With Mia's testimony in hand, Detective Blackwood was able to secure warrants for further investigation into Crawford's network, including his private islands and offshore accounts. The evidence was mounting, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for Crawford's legal team to keep up the charade. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came in the form of newly recovered surveillance footage, which had been carefully hidden by Crawford's team. It was a video of Victoria, taken on the night of her disappearance. At first glance, it appeared innocuous, just another routine security feed of the resort. But when Blackwood closely examined the footage, she noticed something that sent chills down her spine. Crawford was seen following Victoria into a secluded part of the villa complex. They spoke briefly before Crawford led her into a private area, out of view of the cameras. The footage cut off there, but what it showed was clear enough: Victoria had not left of her own accord. She had been led away by Crawford. Blackwood was certain now that Victoria had uncovered something critical, perhaps a financial document or a piece of evidence, that had made her a threat to Crawford's operation. The fact that he had silenced her before she could expose him became increasingly apparent as more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Meanwhile, Sophie was more determined than ever to find her sister. She began to comb through her own records, searching for anything Victoria might have left behind that could help. It was then that she discovered encrypted files on Victoria's laptop, files that had been hidden under layers of passwords and security measures. Sophie managed to crack the encryption, revealing a series of documents and photos that were both damning and heartbreaking. Among the files was a photo of a secluded island, one that was tied to a mysterious location where Crawford had taken several of his victims. The files also contained a recording of a conversation between Victoria and an unnamed individual. In it, Victoria was heard explaining how she had uncovered Crawford's secrets and had been planning to expose him. The recording ended abruptly, with a chilling sound, like a door slamming shut, before the call was disconnected. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Crawford's vast network, his manipulation of the legal system, and the dark secrets he kept hidden were all starting to unravel. But the fight was far from over. As Blackwood and Sophie inched closer to exposing Crawford, the pressure mounted. The local authorities were finally starting to take action, but Crawford's legal team was powerful and well-funded. His reputation had been carefully cultivated over decades, and he had many allies in high places. But Sophie wasn't about to let her sister's story be buried. She pushed harder, going public with the information she had uncovered. Her determination fueled public outrage, and soon, media outlets around the world were reporting on the investigation, demanding answers from Crawford. With the world watching, and the evidence against him mounting, James Crawford was running out of time. The walls were closing in. By the time Detective Jessica Blackwood and Sophie Anderson had pieced together the full scope of James Crawford's crimes, the case had become a media sensation. Public outrage was at a fever pitch. The details of Crawford's manipulation, exploitation, and predatory behavior were being exposed to the world, and the once powerful hotel magnate was now seen as a ruthless predator. He could no longer hide behind his wealth, influence, or the carefully cultivated image of a benevolent businessman. Crawford's legal team had done everything in their power to keep him out of jail, spinning the narrative that the charges against him were fabricated, that the testimonies of former employees were biased, and that the surveillance footage was tampered with. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and the growing public pressure forced authorities to act. On a chilly morning in December 2022, James Crawford was arrested at his penthouse in New York City. The arrest, which was broadcast live to millions, marked the beginning of the end for his empire. Crawford was charged with multiple counts of trafficking, sexual assault, abduction, and murder, his reign of terror spanning over a decade, with victims across several continents. Sophie, who had spent months digging through evidence and working closely with Blackwood, finally felt a sense of justice in the air. It wasn't over yet. Crawford had yet to stand trial, but for the first time, she could breathe. Her sister's memory was no longer buried under layers of deceit. Crawford was going to pay for his crimes. As Crawford was escorted out of his penthouse by the police, reporters shouted questions at him. He remained silent, his face a mask of cold indifference. The man who had controlled so many lives, the man who had manipulated, trapped, and silenced so many women, was finally facing the consequences of his actions. The trial of James Crawford was a highly publicized event that attracted attention from around the world. For the first time, the survivors of Crawford's abuse were able to tell their stories in open court. Their testimonies were harrowing, detailing the systematic abuse and exploitation they had endured at the hands of a man they had once trusted. Among the survivors was Mia Hargrove, the former front desk clerk who had blown the whistle on Crawford's operations. Her testimony was pivotal, as she was able to corroborate the accounts of the other victims, confirming that Crawford's manipulation extended far beyond just one or two women. She described the surveillance systems he had installed on his private islands, the offshore accounts used to hide money, and the methods he used to control the women he preyed on. But the most poignant testimony came from Sophie Anderson herself. In a powerful statement, Sophie described the devastation of losing her twin sister, Victoria, and the pain of knowing that her sister's final days had been filled with fear and isolation. Sophie read from Victoria's diary, quoting the final entry that had been found in the villa, "I'm scared, Sophie. I think he's hiding something." The courtroom was silent as Sophie continued, fighting back tears but determined to speak her truth. Victoria was not just a victim, Sophie said. She was a bright, beautiful young woman who had so much to give. But she was taken from us, taken by someone who should have been held accountable long ago. Today, we fight for her. Today, we fight for justice. Sophie's words resonated with the jury, and the strength she showed in the face of unimaginable grief left an indelible mark on everyone in the courtroom. The emotional weight of the trial made it clear to all that this was not just a legal battle, it was a fight for the voices of the countless women who had been silenced by Crawford's power and influence. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence: DNA samples from Crawford's private islands, encrypted communications, financial records linking him to trafficking operations, and, of course, the surveillance footage from the resort. It became undeniable that James Crawford was guilty of the crimes he had been accused of. His defense team tried to discredit the evidence, claiming it was fabricated, but the sheer volume of testimony and the mounting proof against him left no room for doubt. After a grueling trial that lasted for several weeks, the jury deliberated for just 2 days before returning a guilty verdict. James Crawford was found guilty on all counts, including the trafficking and murder of Victoria Anderson. His once impressive empire crumbled as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted into applause when the verdict was read, and Sophie, standing in the front row, allowed herself a moment of relief. For so long, she had feared that Crawford's wealth and influence would shield him from justice, but now, she knew that the man who had caused so much pain and suffering was finally going to pay for his crimes. In the months that followed, Crawford's assets were seized, and his network of resorts and hotels was dismantled. The funds that were generated from the sale of his properties were redirected toward compensating the victims and supporting survivors of trafficking and exploitation. Crawford's wealth, which had once been a tool for his manipulation, was now being used to right some of the wrongs he had inflicted on the world. In the wake of the trial, Sophie Anderson channeled her grief and anger into something constructive: the Victoria Anderson Foundation. The foundation was created to honor her sister's memory and to provide support and resources to women who had been victims of abuse, trafficking, and exploitation. The Foundation's mission was to raise awareness about the dangers of wealth and power being used to manipulate and control vulnerable individuals. The Foundation worked tirelessly to advocate for legislative reform, pushing for stronger protections for victims of trafficking and abuse. They worked with law enforcement, policymakers, and survivors to create a system that would make it harder for predators like Crawford to operate unchecked. One of the Foundation's key victories was the passage of Victoria's Law, a legislative initiative designed to close loopholes in the justice system that allowed wealthy individuals like Crawford to escape accountability. The law mandated stricter penalties for trafficking and exploitation, as well as comprehensive support systems for victims. Sophie's work became a beacon of hope for others. She traveled the world, speaking at conferences and leading initiatives that brought attention to the systemic issues surrounding wealth, abuse, and exploitation. Through her efforts, she began to rebuild the legacy of her sister, ensuring that Victoria's story would never be forgotten. Though the pain of losing Victoria would never fully disappear, Sophie found purpose in her mission. The Victoria Project, as it became known, continued to grow, saving lives, exposing predators, and changing the landscape of how trafficking and abuse were handled globally. Victoria's story had begun as one of tragedy, but through the relentless pursuit of justice, it became a story of transformation, a story that changed the lives of countless others and sparked a global conversation about abuse, power, and the importance of protecting the most vulnerable members of society. Victoria's name would forever be associated with change, justice, and the hope that, in the end, love and courage could overcome even the darkest of forces.